On Thursday, we started talking about free will, and we covered a number of points. I want to start by going back through them briefly, and if any questions have arisen in the meantime, I'll be happy to discuss them. Those who are new, we have to do them to get them on the table. I'm happy to do that. It's an axiom of Judaism that people have free will. One very important reason for that is anything without free will has no responsibility for what it does. No responsibility means no good and evil, no right and wrong, no reward, no punishment. It's equivalent to a thing or an animal. So for us, since the Torah starts and ends with responsibility and reward and punishment, good and evil, right and wrong, free will is an absolute requirement. And although there are contemporary philosophers who talk about good and evil, right and wrong, without free will, they are subject to a dreadful mistake. That's only my view, but the view of some of the best contemporary philosophers. Of course, like everything else in philosophy, it's controversial, but that is definitely the starting point of the Jewish tradition.
What is the Jewish definition of free will?
Well, definition is probably too strong a word. Let me just insert a remark that the request for a definition isn't always in order. Although philosophers are supposed to live by the battle cry, define your terms, it's a mistake. A request for a definition isn't always in order. We are constantly using concepts for which we have no definitions. Truth, justice, beauty, and the rest. There are no definitions for those concepts, and we're using them all the time, without apology. Someone lies on the stand and we try him for perjury and put him in jail. No one can stop the proceedings on the grounds we don't have a definition of truth. You don't always need a definition. Roughly speaking, concepts have black, white, and gray areas. If those who are using the concept are careful to stay in the black and white areas, there's no need for a definition. Only if you slip into a gray area where the concept is either controversial or not well understood, and that's not exclusive, then maybe a request for a definition or a demand for a definition might be appropriate. But if someone says that Everest is a mountain and what we have around here are hills, and someone says, hold on, how do you define a mountain and hill? Where's your cutoff point exactly? 5,275 feet or what? That's not an appropriate demand. Everest is clearly a mountain, and these are clearly hills, and therefore the use of the concept is perfectly appropriate. Reflect. If you want a definition, how would you go about searching for one if you had no clue what the concept meant? How would you evaluate proposed definitions to discover that they are deficient or perhaps adequate? Wouldn't that require some prior understanding of the concept? When we don't have a definition, it isn't as if, for all we know, justice is marshmallows and the truth is butterflies. We have a lot of understanding and we have considerable lack of understanding. And as long as we stay within the area of the concept that we understand, there is no need for a definition. The demand for a definition is not always appropriate. When someone demands a definition, I think the appropriate response is, show me where the discussion has fallen into a gray area. Show me where it has presupposed the use of the concept in an area that's controversial or poorly understood. Then, the request for a definition could be credited. But otherwise not. And what I'm telling you now in philosophy is trivial. This is not controversial. Anyway, you asked for at least some description of free will in Jewish terms, and the answer is free will is the ability to act on your own without external causation. Causation. By causation, I mean total causation. There are things that you do which aren't totally externally caused. They may be influenced, but they're not caused. That'll be enough of I say it's a description, not a definition. There's some loose ends, but that'll be enough for the sake of our discussion. And if I use the term in a way that doesn't answer that description, then you can stop me and say, listen, you told us to meant this, using it in a different way. What do you mean now? That would be an appropriate thing to do. Are we together so far? Okay. Now, if you don't have free will, if something you do, I'm leaving out certain details at this point, But anything that doesn't have free will at all, a creature without free will, everything it does is totally caused from the outside, like, as the metaphor has it, a chip of wood floating on the surface of a body of water, and it's up and down. It's just a matter of the ripples on the water. That certainly has no responsibility for what it does. Nothing it does can be classified as good or evil, right or wrong, justified or unjustified. It's not impartial. It's not part of that whole discussion. As we start with the idea of responsibility, as I said, there's no way that we can abide not having free will. Yeah.
So according to your description, animals also have free will.
Not at all. What makes you think that anything a dog does isn't totally caused by...
What external influence is causing a dog to do something? There was an instinct. If anything, it's internal.
But that internal is the result of DNA and environmental programming. So that means it's ultimately external, isn't it? DNA comes from the parents externally to this creature, and the environmental programming is from the environment, which is external to this creature, and therefore it's external. Any more than saying that a computer has free will because it's running on its own program. But of course it was programmed by an external force.
We're all programmed.
So you say, but for that you have no reason whatsoever. There's no reason whatsoever to think that a human being is totally programmed. Indeed, I would challenge you. You have a reason for thinking that we are totally programmed?
We learn from our environment.
That's influence. I'm talking about total programming.
Nobody's totally programmed.
Good. That's my position. But I say that animals are. And I ask you, in the case of a human being, I say that animals are totally programmed by their external. There's no evidence whatsoever there's anything that they operate on which they didn't get from their DNA and from their environment. With respect to human beings, the opposite is the case. There's plenty of evidence that we operate in spite of what we're programmed. But is it conclusive evidence? No, but there's certainly no conclusive evidence that we are totally programmed. None whatsoever. Yeah.
But DNA is not solely on external factors. DNA also has mutations, but also internal. So he's not entirely wrong.
No. When the DNA mutates, it's because of some external factor that causes it to mutate. Is it not? Is it not the presence of chemicals or cosmic rays or some other external factor that causes it to mutate?
Right, correct. But sometimes we can't understand why translocations happen or why insertions happen. We can't understand.
The fact that we can't understand it doesn't mean that it's not external.
Doesn't mean it's not internal too.
Well, but the internal structure that is now evolving is a result of an external influence. It comes from a zygote that was formed from a sperm and an egg, right? Which come from previous independent entities. Okay. So that means ultimately this creature that is developing because ultimately of influences that started outside of it.
So the only thing that's not external is the soul? Because then everything else
is not external? The only thing that's not external? I mean, the whole world is external. This table is external to me. The whole thing that's not, you don't mean what you're saying. The whole thing that's not external is the soul? You don't mean that.
Because we live in an external world.
Of course. Nothing I said would lead to the conclusion that this table is not external to me.
And the fact that this table is here influences us to behave in a certain way.
Influence is correct. I agree to that. What I said is there's no evidence that there's a total cause external to me. A total cause that determines everything that I do. For that, there's no evidence. Now, I started with this yesterday. We talked about there are people who are determinists about behavior. That's their position. I don't think they have any convincing evidence, but that's their position. And I asked what kind of evidence they might offer. And one kind of evidence we considered was statistics. A person will say, look at the influence of the environment on your development. You can see it in hard facts. In Watts, California, take the population of 17-year-olds, 3/4 are illiterate. And take the population in Shaker Heights, Ohio, and it's 100% or 98% literate. Obviously, the environment is programming your literary development, your linguistic development. My answer to that was, since in Watts you only have a 75% statistic, that ought to influence you to think maybe there's some other feature involved. If the environment gives you a 75% result and 25% are different, it's natural to think there's something else that's responsible for the difference of that 25%. Now, the determinist has an answer to this, but as you'll see, as we saw yesterday, that the answer is not adequate. The answer the determinist will give us is this. You're right. Our statistic is only 75%. That's true. But the other 25% is also environment. It's also environment. For example, maybe this child that's literate, who has linguistic ability, maybe this child's mother is a school teacher or father. Or maybe he has an uncle in Ohio and spends his summers in Ohio and gets out of Watts. Or maybe he's the oldest child in the family, which means that he had a longer period with father and mother before the parents divorced. So those are the kinds of environmental influences that make the difference, that make the 25% different from the other 75%. And what I said yesterday was that this is inadequate, and it's important to see why it's inadequate. Because at this point, the believer, the so-called scientist, is not giving you facts, he's giving you guesses. Maybe the mother was a school teacher. Maybe they had an uncle in Ohio. Maybe he's the oldest child. Maybe he hasn't actually cataloged these features and built his statistic into 100%. If he had cataloged them, he could say as follows. Everyone grows up illiterate unless he has these and these features, and these are the features which make the difference, and therefore I can account for 100% of the population. They never do that. What they do is they simply tell you that the rest of it is environmental because they're committed to the environment being the engine that does the job. Well, that's their commitment. It's a free world. You can have any commitments you like. But I don't interview scientists for their commitments. I interview scientists for their evidence. And there's no evidence that the environment is doing the whole job. There simply isn't that evidence. As long as you can't produce 100% statistics, there's no evidence that the environment is doing the whole of the job, nor the DNA in this case. I did give an example yesterday where you could say the environment is doing 100% of the job. It's not as if it's impossible to do this, it's just that it hasn't been done. I gave the example of an 8-year-old who was captured by a local gang and forcibly injected with crack. Do that to the kid 3 times, and you can predict with 100% certainty that if he lives, he'll steal. Because to support a crack habit, you've got to steal. So here you have a 100% statistic. It's just that the example is extreme, extremely extreme. Being caught and injected with crack, that's not typical of the rest of human behavior. One could never generalize and say, well, you see, in this case it's 100%, so every place else is 100%, where I don't have the environment to specify? Of course not. So that being the case, the attempt at evidence through statistics is not going to work. And that being the case, you don't have evidence of 100% programming. I'm not mentioning the fact that there are great people who think they have proofs against 100% programming. But the positive evidence in favor is simply not adequate, as I've just shown you. And that being the case, we don't have to retreat in the face of a pseudo-scientific attack. Everybody knows the human being is just a machine. In fact, people do not know that. That's one of the important points we made yesterday. We're together? We said yesterday that the existence of free will does not contradict the existence of commandments, because a commandment tells you what it's right to do, what it's good to do, and what you ought to do. That does not contradict your ability to rebel, your ability to violate. It tells you what should be, not what will be. And that being the case, since as we started, we describe free will as a power, the power to act on your own. The fact that there are commandments does not contradict that. We did talk at the end, and I'll do a little more of this in a little more detail because it's a little complicated, about foreknowledge and free will. This is a problem which the Mishnah already recognizes. Hakol tzafui v'rushus nesuna. Everything is foreseen, and yet you have power. Don't mistranslate rushus as permission. It's power. And you have the power to act on your own. If God can see the future, if God knows the future, how can we be making our own decisions? How can we be free to make our own decisions? Now, as is often the case, it's important to state the problem carefully. I'll state it for you. In the first part of the 20th century, philosophy struggled to state the problem carefully, Took a couple of decades, and what they ended up with is precisely what Maimonides said 900 years before. Of course, nobody reads Maimonides. Why should they do that? But it turned out to be accurate. And then I'll show you how there are many approaches to this problem, but I'll show you one direct solution to the problem, which is found in our literature. Let's picture making a free decision. I'm deciding between A and B. I've done this before. Sometimes I choose A, sometimes I choose B. And now I'm deciding again to make a free choice between A and B. I'm considering ups and downs and testing consequences. And then at the last moment, I say B. I'm choosing B. In my mind, the way I experience it, I had two options. Each one was open to me. Each one was possible to me. And it was my choice at the last second that determined which one would be true. I chose B, and that's why B took place. Now the critic says, are you religious? And I say, look at my hat. Are you dumb? Of course I'm religious. No, I don't have anybody else wear a hat like this. Okay, you believe in God? Yes. You believe in God is all-knowing, omniscient? Yes, of course. Do you believe that God was omniscient yesterday? Come on, are you joking? Of course he was omniscient yesterday. That includes knowing the future? Of course. Yesterday, God knew the whole future. In particular, says the critic, he knew your future decision, that you were going to choose B? I say, yes, of course. Well, says the critic, now I've got you in a hole. Because, ask yourself, if he knew yesterday that you were going to choose B today, was A really an option for you? Think. Choosing A today would mean you'd be contradicting God's knowledge yesterday that you're going to choose B. Can you really contradict God's knowledge? Isn't God's knowledge perfect, infallible? Isn't it impossible for you to do A? Think. To say A is possible for you means it's possible for you to contradict God's knowledge yesterday. That's got to be nonsense. Can't even be possible to contradict God's knowledge yesterday. So, says the critic, A wasn't really open. A wasn't really a possibility. Wasn't an option. So you weren't really choosing between two options. You chose the only thing that was possible. And if you think of free will as choosing between two alternatives, two options, then you ain't got it. You haven't got it. By your own position, critic here is not taking any position of his own, just criticizing my position. By your own position, you believe in God, you believe in foreknowledge. So A wasn't possible. And if A wasn't possible, you have to agree you weren't choosing between two options, both of which were possible for you. That's the problem of foreknowledge and free will. Are we together? Okay. But there's a solution. Because the problem is based on a hidden premise, as often is the case in philosophy and in logic. It's based on a hidden premise, and the minute you jiggle that hidden premise, you can see how the problem can be resolved. And as I said yesterday, not only is this in our sources, in the Akedas Yitzchak and in Rashad Gaon's Amonos Videos, but Lahavdil, Bertrand Russell thought of this 100 years ago, and Bertrand Russell said, don't try to beat up the religious believer on these grounds, because he's got a solution. Bertrand Russell was a very famous atheist. Okay, let's go through the problem again, and I'll point out where the hidden assumption is. I think I'm choosing between A and B, and both are open. Both are options, both are possible. I admit, and I choose B. And I admit that yesterday, God knew that I was going to choose B. Now the critic says, well then, consider the option of choosing A. If you chose A, that would contradict God's knowledge yesterday that you're going to choose B. Here's the hidden assumption. The hidden assumption is that God's knowledge yesterday of what I'm going to choose is independent of what I choose. It's independent of what I choose. He knew yesterday I was going to choose B, and now as I'm imagining the alternative of choosing A, we're holding his knowledge yesterday of choosing B constant. Maybe that's not right. Maybe God's knowledge yesterday is sensitive to what I choose today. So that the reason he knew yesterday that I was going to choose B is because I chose B today. And if you imagine the alternative of choosing A today, then it would follow that yesterday he would know I was going to choose A, not B. Because his knowledge yesterday reflects what I choose today. Bertrand Russell's cute example of this was to say, maybe God yesterday gets his knowledge of what I'm going to choose by taking a sneak peek at the future. God yesterday looks at today and says, oh, there's Gottlieb making his choice. I'm tracking him. Okay, he's tracking me from yesterday. That's hard for us, but God, God's not limited in that way. God's tracking, and he sees me yesterday choosing B. He says, now I know what he's going to do tomorrow because I saw him do it tomorrow. I see him ahead of time choosing B. If that's the picture, and we imagine that I don't choose B, but I choose A, then we have to imagine God from yesterday is looking at today and watching what I'm doing and seeing that I'm doing A, in which case his knowledge yesterday will be that I will do A, not B. And then there's no contradiction whatsoever. As long as God's knowledge is sensitive to what I choose, let's go a step further. Sensitive is vague enough. Let's say my choice causes God's knowledge. My choice causes God's knowledge. He gets his knowledge from my choice. Then when we imagine, instead of choosing B, that I were to choose A, I'll have to then adjust what his knowledge is. If I imagine myself choosing A, then his knowledge will be that I choose A. There's no contradiction and no difficulty. And it's certainly perfectly possible for that to happen. So, that being the case, the problem has a direct solution. The problem is based on a hidden assumption. We don't have to accept that hidden assumption. And that being the case, we can solve the problem. Now, there are a few feelings of uneasiness that accompany this solution. Let me mention them and show you how we would handle them. I'm happy to discuss this until we're satisfied that we at least understand it. You can choose to agree or disagree, obviously, but at least we understand it together. Some people are disturbed about the idea that something about God should be caused by me. I should cause something in God? Isn't God above that? Independent, perfect, self-contained, beyond influence altogether? I think that intuition, although it has certainly a kosher source, that intuition needs to be handled with care. God has chosen a responsive posture with respect to the creation. The proof of that is something we mentioned already this hour. Yes, that's meant to make you think, gee, what was that? Can I figure it out? Can I guess what he means? Something we mentioned in this hour, which shows that God has chosen a responsive posture to the creation. That's reward and punishment. Reward and punishment means what God gives me depends upon what I do. If I do X, I'll get a certain kind of response. If I do Y, I'll get a different kind of response. So God's treatment of me depends upon what I do, which means he's reacting to my behavior. That's a reactive position. It's not obvious that God should do that or needs to do that. God doesn't need to do anything. He can do as he pleases. But he has chosen to do that. Once you have, as part of your picture of God's relationship to the world, a reactive posture in some respect, having a second one is not such a terrible breach of one's intuition. Once God has told you, I chose to relate to the creation in a reactive way, so there's another way that he can choose to relate to it in a reactive way. If someone is concerned, more abstractly philosophical level, what are you talking about? Your action today has an effect on God yesterday? Can you really do that? Can an action today have an effect yesterday? I mean, how does that work? Isn't always cause and effect that the cause comes before the effect? Isn't that just obvious? So let me fill you in on a couple of interesting details. Philosophy has been trying to prove for 200 years that the cause comes before the effect without success. There's no accepted philosophical argumentation that the cause has to come before the effect. Number one, okay, that's only philosophy. Philosophy is soft. Philosophy is just aping science as best it can. What about science? In science, you have actual cases where first-class physicists say that the effect comes first, like Richard Feynman in his famous book QED, which stands for Quantum Electrodynamics. He has particle interactions where he says that the cause comes after the effect. Things can work backwards in time. That's his interpretation. John Wheeler agrees. These are outstanding. Feynman had the Nobel Prize in physics. So if philosophy can't deny it, and physics at least sometimes wants to use it, no one should trust his intuition that it just can't be so. You can't fight with philosophy and physics, especially physics, on the grounds that, golly, it seems to me crazy. That's not a very good basis on which to reject something. So if we have a picture of what's called in the literature backwards causation, backwards in time causation, I don't think we have to be embarrassed about that, especially since in philosophy and physics you're talking within our world, within our physical world. We're talking about God's relationship to the world. That is much looser, has many more degrees of freedom how God relates to the world than how particles behave. Now, I'd like to fill this out with a picture that maybe you can relate to intuitively, how this works. The picture is just an elaboration. I don't need it for the solution. The solution is already on the table. The solution is the problem of foreknowledge and free will. But the picture sometimes helps people. God relates to the world in two ways. There's another piece of Jewish philosophy which is important. I'm not going to go into it in detail. I'm going to use it. God is present at every element of the creation. Every moment of space-time, every event, every particle, those are all overlapping terms. All of it, God is present at. That's what's called technically immanence. He, so to speak, his presence fills the creation. But he's also creator. Creator means he stands outside the creation. So if you want a picture of it, think of a timeline. And on the timeline, from earlier to later, each point on the line is the entire universe at that time. And we're moving along the line from earlier to later. God is present at every point on the line. That's one aspect. And the other aspect, since he creates the whole thing, he stands outside the whole line as well. Now, here's how my action today produces God's knowledge yesterday. In 3 steps. Step 1, today, here, when I choose B over A, God is present. He's present at my event of choosing B over A. That's step 1. Step 2, since God stands apart from the entire line, that knowledge of what I choose is available to God above the line altogether. Step 3, since it's available to God above the line, and he's present at every point on the line, it now becomes available to God's presence yesterday. It's a 3-step process from my choice today to his knowledge yesterday. That being the case, when we imagine the alternative of my choosing A, that will readjust God's knowledge yesterday to A. There's no contradiction whatsoever. And that means we have no problem of reconciling foreknowledge and free will. That's one treatment to the problem. Questions on this? Okay, up to here? Yeah.
Why can't we just say that gods are limited by the laws of nature? Meaning, we are trying to limit God into a dimension called time, when God is the one who created that dimension. So God is outside time.
Okay.
So, in reality, when something happens now, for God, it's the past, present, and future at the same time. Even though for us, it's just the present.
Okay, first of all, that's a standard solution. The Tosfos Yom Tov takes that solution, and he says the Rambam solution. I don't think that's correct, but he takes that solution. It's a standard solution. I would not put it the way you did, because things can't be simultaneous unless they're in time. Not quite right to say that past, present, and future are all simultaneous, meaning at the same time, or something that's outside of time. But the way you ought to say, and this is what they do say, and this is very well accepted, not only in Judaism, but in Christianity as well, that you don't date anything about God. You don't put a date on God or anything about God. That being the case, saying he knew yesterday is going to be out of court. It's going to be out of court. But the truth is, I used to use this as a separate solution until I saw a tshuva of the Rivash. And then the tshuva of the Rivash makes it clear that you're working with exactly the same dynamic as the solution that I just gave. You're putting it in different terms, but the guts of the solution in logical terms is the same. What's the point of someone making it foreknowledge? What's the point of saying he knew yesterday? Why make that the problem? Why not just say he knows? or say he has the knowledge. What's the point of making it yesterday? The point of making it yesterday is to put it out of reach of my choice, to make it independent of my choice. Once it's independent of my choice, we're going to have trouble. Now, if you put God outside of time, you'll have the same trouble. Let's say God is outside of time. But if his knowledge is absolute, if his knowledge isn't sensitive to my choice, putting him outside of time won't help. What, in fact, is his knowledge outside of time? Well, I did A, so his knowledge is, I did B, so his knowledge is that I did B, right? Outside of time, with no date. But if it's outside of time and it's not sensitive to my choice, we're going to have exactly the same problem. Then was it possible for me to do A? Since his knowledge is, was, will be, and is absolute as B, then doing A becomes impossible again. The solution can only be to make his knowledge a product of my choice, in or out of time.
You can say it depends on perspective. From God's perspective, he knows what you're going to do. From your perspective, you have a choice.
But now we've moved to a third idea, right? First of all, my idea is still on the table, and what you have said is not attacked my idea. Number two, you tried a second idea, and now, without sort of registering it, you're sliding to a third idea. I'm happy to do that, but let's keep track of where we're going. The idea that we
third idea is keeping the second idea alive.
Well, I don't think so, because before we didn't have perspectives. And now we're supposed to have perspectives, which means sort of there's two different views on the same thing. We didn't have that before. I think the idea that you suggested before is not going to work. But now, when you talk about perspectives, that's begs the question as to what the truth is. There are different perspectives on things. Sometimes they're both true. Sometimes neither is true. Sometimes one is true and the other one is not true. Saying perspectives just leaves me in doubt as to what it is that's being asserted. Are they both supposed to be true?
But that's the world we live in. It comes back to what we said before about identifying things. I might identify one thing as one, like this book. I might identify this book as this, and you might identify completely differently.
But now again,
it depends on perspective.
Yes, but what you're saying now isn't answering my question. Rav Dessler's example is this. I have a thing that's rectangular, flat, and white. Someone else says, I have a thing that's straight, very thin, and black. Is that the same thing? Different things? We'll consider a piece of paper. A piece of paper seen flat on is rectangular, flat, and white. Seen edge on is very thin and black. Is it the same thing? Could be. It could be. The same thing from two perspectives. That means they're both true about the very same object. That's fine. So sometimes you get different perspectives and they're both true. Sometimes you can't have that because they disagree. Suppose someone says, I have an object that's flat, white, and no thin black lines involved, period. The other guy says, I have a thin black line and no flat white things involved, period. Then you have a contradiction. They can't both be right. So it depends upon how you articulate the content of the perspectives and what you think of as a contradiction or is not a contradiction, and you'll have all sorts of different cases. So if you say, from our point of view, you have a choice, from his point of view, we don't have a choice, okay, that's fine. Are they both true? Then that would mean we both do and do not have a choice. That's not helpful because that's just a straight contradiction. That doesn't explain anything to anybody. Maybe you'll say, but God's perspective is really true and ours is just a mistake. Okay, but then if God's perspective, if you're going to give precedence for one or the other, I would naturally vote for God's over mine, but then that means I don't really have free will, and that means I don't really have responsibility. That means God's punishing me for my failures is unjust, as Maimonides says in the Laws of Repentance, chapter 6. So that's not going to be an option philosophically. So the perspective is not going to help here. Anyway, that's an answer to the problem of foreknowledge and free will. I want to give you another one, which is much more radical. This is really the Rambam's point of view. And it spills over into other thoughts as well. We're talking, to make this problem work, we're talking about God's knowledge. Maybe we should question that. Maybe we should question talking about God altogether. Are we really competent to talk about God? Is God the kind of thing about which we can have any knowledge, any understanding, any description, any glimpse? Let me just tell you a fact, which as your Jewish scholarship develops, you'll see for yourselves. The whole of the tradition, the philosophical part of the tradition and the Kabbalistic part of the tradition, reject the idea that you can describe God at all. They reject the idea that you can describe God at all. Maimonides says it in these three different places. The Kuzari says it. Those who follow say it as well. And the Kabbalistic tradition, nothing, no thought grasps God. If you take that position, you don't have a solution to the problem. You have a dissolution of the problem. The problem was P against Q, and now we're just giving up P. We're giving it up. Problem was God's knowledge versus free will. We're giving up God's knowledge. We're just giving it up. Of course, first step, of course, giving up God's knowledge doesn't mean we are agreeing that he's ignorant, because ignorant is another human description. If we're going to leave off describing God altogether, then we can't say he knows and we can't say he's ignorant either, because those are both human descriptions. We have to be thorough and consistent about this. We're going to stop describing God altogether, which, if you want to look it up, is in the guide, part 1, chapters 50 through 60. So, we're really going to avoid the problem, dissolve the problem by saying we're not going to assert one half of what makes the contradiction. But then the critic, and I think every normal person, will say, what are you talking about? You have to describe God. So you've given up Judaism altogether. Doesn't Judaism have hundreds of descriptions of God? There's 1,000 pages of the Tanakh, of the Hebrew Bible. And there's all of the Talmud and the Midrash. The Siddur. Are we describing God all the time? What are you talking about? This has got to be crazy. It's got to be insane. The answer that's given, both by the philosophical tradition and by the Kabbalistic tradition, is that those are all descriptions of what God does, not what God is. They're all descriptions of what God does, but not what God is. That means, when you come across a description in the literature, God is Q, there's a 3-step process. Step 1, pretend that God really is Q. Pretend. We'll take it back at the end, but for the time being, pretend. Then ask yourself, if God were really Q, what would he do? How would that affect his actions? That's step 2. Step 3, subtract Q and just remain with the description of his actions. And that's what is really intended. Just the description of the actions, not the word or phrase that seem to be describing him in terms of what he is. I'll give you some examples to try to make this clear. Say, God is just. Step 1, pretend that God is really just. Step 2, ask, if he's really just, what would he do? Well, he'd make sure that people got what they deserve. That's what justice is, making sure people get what they deserve. Step 3, subtract the description of God as just and remain with people will get what they deserve. That's what's going to happen in the world. God is merciful. Okay, step 1, pretend he's really merciful. Step 2, ask, what kind of effect does mercy have on the behavior of someone who is merciful? Answer, well, maybe you're committed to justice, but not right away. And if it's punishment, not in its full measure, and you give people a second chance, and you encourage them, and you save them from the demands of justice when they're too difficult to take or might destroy the person. That's what mercy does. Mercy modifies the application of justice. Fine. Step 3, subtract the description of merciful and say, justice doesn't always take place right away, and it doesn't, when it's negative, when the justice is punishment, it doesn't happen in full force, and so on and so on. Just remain with the description of the effect of mercy without the quality of mercy being used to describe God. That's the program. The program is, whenever you have a description of God, take the description, first pretend it's real, deduce what effect it will have on what God does, and then step 3, subtract the description and remain with the description of what he does. Interestingly, I think fascinatingly, Luzzatto, great Kabbalist, in one of the works that's not translated into English, called Rishonim, on the first page, gives a list of God's qualities, which are really his qualities of behavior, qualities of action. And on that page, he mentions knowledge twice. He counts knowledge as a description of action. So he's saying word for word what I'm telling you. Now, that seem to be challenging or difficult. After all, If you talk about justice, justice is, in the end, how you deal with people. Mercy is, in the end, how you deal with people. What about knowledge? Knowledge sounds like a description of God's internal state, so to speak. How are you going to trace out the effect on action of knowledge and then say, we'll subtract the knowledge and remain with the effect on action? Here's a way to do it. Ask yourself, as I did before, what difference would knowledge make to action? The answer is, every action will be planned and coordinated with every other fact so that it'll be appropriate given the past, present, and future of every other fact. That's what an agent would do with knowledge. He would use his knowledge to make sure that what happens now is perfectly coordinated with everything else. Fine, that's step 2. Step 3, subtract the knowledge and remain with what happens is coordinated in a perfect way. That's all you need. So we end up with a picture of not describing God at all, in particular not describing God as having knowledge, and therefore there's no contradiction to free will. And you ask what we do with respect to the other descriptions. The answer is we use them as a way to trace out types of behavior, but no more than that. If you want to see that in particular in the guide, it's part 1, chapter 54. Maimonides says these words word for word, just like Luzzatto says it in his Kabbalistic writings. Now, there's one more point about this that I want to answer today. More discussion, I'll leave it for you. Ultimately, someone or some people are going to say, Rabbi, this is just a dodge. This is just a dodge. Come on. Be realistic. You can't talk about God. You're just doing that to avoid the problem of foreknowledge and free will. And it's intellectually suspect. No one else would do that. No one would say that we don't know what a thing is. We only know what it does. I mean, that's just a dodge. It's intellectually irresponsible and muddled, and just shows you're desperate if you try to do that. Well, let's consider the history and some of contemporary science. Is it really muddled to say that I know what a thing does, but I don't know what it is? I don't think that's muddled at all. I think we've been in that position from the beginning of science. Let's consider a very simple example. Mendel discovered genetic dependence. He discovered statistically that pea plants, if they have certain characteristics, then the offspring will have certain characteristics in certain proportions. He gave a name to it. The thing that carries the memory of the characteristics is genes. Did he have a clue what a gene was? They didn't even know what molecules were in those days. Do you think it was the DNA? Or now we have epigenetics, so it's not so simple. The cell? He didn't have a clue what it was. He says, Gregor Mendel. Right? He didn't have a clue what they were. He just knew what they did. There's something in there that's keeping track. Maybe it's an associated leprechaun. I don't know. But clearly it comes out statistically the same every time. So there's something there that's keeping track. Let's call it a gene. I know what it's doing, but I don't know what it is or how it's doing it. There's nothing wrong with that. Nothing suspect about that. Nothing intellectually irresponsible about that. What about light? We're surrounded by light all the time. Well, Descartes thought Newton thought light was particles, and you had Young's wave interference experiments. No one had a clue what light was. And by the way, as of now, they still don't, right? Because in quantum mechanics, it behaves as Einstein's bad, and quantum mechanics is worse. It behaves as a particle and a wave simultaneously. If they told you it behaves as a particle in some experiments and a wave in other experiments, that's not strictly accurate. It behaves as a particle and a wave in the very same experiments under the very same conditions. Some people have coined the whimsical term a wavicle. That's what it is, a wavicle, sort of cousin of a popsicle. Nobody knows what light is. We just know how it behaves under various conditions, and that's all we know. Maybe we'll come to better understanding in the future, and maybe we won't. But the idea that we are, in science all the time, faced with things where we chart their behavior, we don't know what they are. I mentioned to you dark energy and dark matter. We know they exist because of what they do, and we haven't got a clue today what they are. It would be wonderful to figure it out. As of now, we don't have a clue what they are. We just know they exist because of what they do. There's absolutely nothing intellectually suspect about saying there is something whose behavior I can describe, but whose essence, whose existence, whose nature, I cannot describe. Did I tell you about Bertrand Russell on elementary particles? Bertrand Russell, I mean, remember, he's no friend of ours. He's a campaigning atheist. for his whole life. He wrote a book, Why I Am Not a Christian. So if he says something that's friendly to us, there's really definitely a solid foundation. He made a remark about science that is very deep, and people are still using it today. Science describes the world as being built out of very little elementary things. Everything else is built up out of those. Okay. Let's make it simple. Let's talk about protons and neutrons, electrons, leave the quarks aside. I'll talk about quarks, we can, but we don't need it. Ask Russell, what does science describe about those little things? What kind of qualities, characteristics, properties of those little things does it describe? And Russell, being a logician and a philosopher, pointed out that everything that's described about those little things is how they relate to other things. All of them are relations. Nothing about the thing itself, just how it relates. For example, mass. The mass of a particle. The mass is how much resistance it has against energy, which is accelerating it. The more mass, the harder it is to accelerate. That's the definition of mass. It's called inertial mass. How much inertia it uses as resistance to energy that's pushing it to accelerate, force. Spin. Spin means when you bounce something off a particle, it doesn't bounce back straight, it bounces off at an angle. That's called intrinsic angular momentum because it has something which causes things to bounce off at an angle. So spin is things bounce off at an angle. Charge. Charge means things like it repels, and things different from it in certain ways, it attracts. It's all how it relates to other things. So Russell said, golly, if science is only telling me how things relate to each other, it's telling me nothing about what they are. As far as science is concerned, that's up for grabs. Could be anything. But science isn't telling me about that. It's only telling me how they relate to each other. Well, Russell said, maybe the elementary building blocks, I'm glad you're all sitting down, maybe the elementary building blocks of the universe are thoughts. Thoughts. Electron is a thought. Proton is a thought. Neutron is a thought. Of course, they're very dull thoughts. Electron is this charge, this charge, this charge, this mass, this mass, this mass, this spin, this spin, this spin, forever. That's all it is. Okay, said Russell, if the elementary building blocks are thoughts, maybe then we could understand how, when you get a few quadrillion of them together in your body, you can think so well. Because you're built out of thoughts. You're built out of thoughts. Instead of there being a barrier between the physical and thought, which today is a very serious barrier, maybe there's no barrier at all. It's called panpsychism. Psychism for psyche, which is thought and experience. Pan means everywhere. It means thought and experience is everywhere, even in rocks. Nice idea. Thought, interesting idea. But Russell's pointing out that science only talks about relationships, doesn't talk about what the thing is in and of itself. So, when we say there's something which we don't know what it is, but we know what it does, turns out, according to Russell, all science is that way. Now, to cap it, there's a fellow named Bernard, I can't pronounce his name because it's French, Bernard d'Espagnat or something like that. If you don't spell it exactly right, Google will find it for you, don't worry. He won the Temple Prize a couple of years ago, and he made the following observation. He's a physicist, well-known, well-respected physicist. He made the following observation. Neutrons are unstable. Put them in a nucleus, that's fine. They're held together, and they can stick around for millions of billions of years. No problem, according to the scientific view. Bust the nucleus, have them free, and they're unstable. They do what's called decay within a couple of seconds on the average, half-life. They decay into a proton, an electron, and a neutrino. A trio of new particles. That's what they do. Now, the word decay, and it stands for the idea that the neutron ceases to exist and it's replaced by. No one thinks that the neutron is a bag, and inside it there are these three particles sort of tied together in the bag, and then when you bust the bag, the three particles come out. Nobody thinks that because the neutron doesn't behave that way. Protons have quarks. Neutrons have quarks, but not these three. Not these three. No, it's a fundamental change. The neutron ceases to exist, and these three take its place. Fine. exact same sum, total of mass energy. Fine. Says the Aspinat, or how do you pronounce his name? Listen, in science, when something works all the time, every time, without exception, we understand that there's some reality causing that to happen. We don't just let that float. There's some reason why it works that way. I tell you, says this fellow, I tell you that you're seeing the surface of a hidden reality. He calls it the veiled reality hypothesis. Obviously, behind the neutron on the one hand, and the trio that comes out on the other hand, there's something there. There's something there that's responsible for this transition always happening exactly the same way. So he says, what we see in the laboratory is the surface of a veiled reality. Behind it is some reality we're not seeing, and all we're seeing is how it behaves. Okay, there's a third example of where you have a picture of, there's a thing, I don't know what the thing is, I only know how it behaves. So I think that if we're describing God in that way, we're saying that God, what God is beyond our ability to understand. God is what's called transcendent, infinite, beyond. But we can describe what he does. That should not be regarded as intellectual dodge, some kind of irresponsibility, some kind of anti-intellectualism or anti-logic. On the contrary, human beings are in that condition very often. And by the way, in the ancient times, when ancient people thought that thinking goes on in the heart, I think it was the ancient Greeks who speculated, you know what the brain is for? The brain is a radiator to get rid of excess heat. So all those folds means it's got a lot of surface area, and the surface area is good for getting rid of excess heat. But the thinking goes on in the heart. Does that mean that they couldn't really describe the results of thinking and problem solving and emotions and so on because they didn't know where it was, didn't know what was behind it? Certainly not. We're in that position all the time. So we use that way of dealing with God. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. There's anything intellectually suspect about it. And that is the official Jewish position. That God's existence, his nature, his essence, his qualities, if there were qualities, are something beyond our ability to describe, understand, conceptualize. But what he does, we can describe. Oh, and I should say, how can we describe what he does? Because he told us. Not because we figure it out. It's not a research project or intuition. He told us what he does. And therefore, we do have descriptions of what he does. Nothing intellectually suspect about being in that position. Questions up there? Yeah.
So when you were listing all of what he does, was that all listed that he gave to us?
Okay, that's okay. I'm glad to hear that. You're really following the whole thing. It works like this. Maimonides says in Part 1, Chapter 54, he says like this. The description is God is X. Now that term X describes people. It also describes God. Thereby hangs a whole tale, which we have to talk about, Yes Hashem. That term, now, when it describes people, I know what it means. Merciful. In people, merciful means two things. It's a quality of soul. It's a quality of character, of personality, of feeling, and also it gives rise to action. So what you're supposed to do is this. Take the word as it describes a human being, then use it to describe God, but only one half. Only the part that describes action, not the part that describes the inner workings of the soul, because that we can't describe in God. So that's really what we're doing. We're starting with our understanding of the way it works for human beings, and then we're using it for God as well. What I'm telling you now, I mean, you asked a deep question, I'm telling you now has a lot of implications. The sources, especially the Kabbalistic sources, say that all spiritual concepts are learned through physical experience. All spiritual concepts are learned through physical experience. Because the soul, when it comes into this world, gets a gigantic step down, a gigantic reduction in its abilities. If it didn't, then putting it together with the body would just cause an explosion. The body would just explode. The soul has to be stepped down to the limitations of this world. Soul is not part of space and time. Soul shouldn't have any limitations of space and time. How is it that I can only see to the next opaque surface and not beyond? Because the soul is limited to seeing through the eyes. From the soul's nature, space and time are no limit whatsoever. Do you know where the nature of the soul shows? It shows in thought. Think about yesterday. Think about 100 years ago. Think about 1,000 years ago. Is it getting hard now? Are you sweating? Think about 2,000 years ago. Is that beyond your strength? 2,000 years. I don't think I can make it to there. Think about here. Think about Alpha Centauri. Think about 14 billion light years into space. There's no effort at all. The mind isn't limited by space and time at all. Thinking about different spaces and different times, it's trivial. The mind reflects the inherent character of the soul. Sensation, the senses reflect the limitations of the body. The soul is very largely limited by the limitations of the body. Gathering information is only within the limits of the body. So it is conceptually. Why is the literature about loving God all based on the picture of human love? Starting with Song of Songs. Maimonides follows Song of Songs literally and explicitly in describing love of God. Why? Because love of God is a spiritual concept, and you can only learn about spirituality through experience in the physical world. That's part of what happens to the soul when it's limited by coming into this world. So this is an example of it as well, that the ideas of justice and mercy and the rest, I learned from human context, and then I apply them to God with the limitation that in the case of God, it doesn't describe the inner reality, the inner life, it describes only the behavior. That's very good. Okay, tomorrow we'll start over again. I'll review what I did today, and then if there are questions, otherwise we'll continue going.